Okay, so the good, the bad, and the ugly. I will talk about Meteor and Angular and Meteor plus Angular, which is a package trying to support both of them. I thank you for coming, and I will also talk about why I'm doing this talk. But first, who am I? I'm a dancer. I'm a geek, and this is primarily the part of me why I'm doing this talk. And I'm an expert for playful personal development, and this is what I call my main profession. So this is something about who I am, and this is the overview of what I will do. So next up, I will talk about why, so why this talk, and why Angular and Meteor. And then I will go into the different components, one being Angular. Then in between, I will talk about very briefly about Ionic, because in my demo you will see it, and I think it makes sense to separate out which is which. And then next up, Meteor, which some of you know plenty about, and then the fusion will culminate when we talk about the combination of using Angular and Meteor. How does that look like? Why would I even care? And then since an option is only as good as its alternatives, I will briefly touch what alternatives there are, or I see, I perceive. And then the next part is what I'm, like the next two things is what I'm looking forward to. One being the demo, where I can show you what I've been doing and what my learnings were. So both what I liked and what I disliked. And after the demo, my definitely favorite part will be the questions and discussion. And I'm really looking forward to hearing what you think about what I'm presenting and the comparison of different options out there. So without further ado, this is the guideline, our roadmap. Why doing this talk? First, I'm in this sharing community. I've been part of using open source projects, and I really like the whole notion of sharing. And I don't want to stop when it comes to passing on experience. So this is mine, and I will try to also get your feedback in between. So this is yes, no, speed up, and slow down. You can also give me feedback during the talk so I know where you are at right now. We'll just practice that. So speed up or slow down? Speed up. All right. And then next up, the why Angular and Meteor. And I think it will be, I will talk about that more after we have taken a look at the components. But the sole reason for me is to combine the positives of Angular and the positives of Meteor. And so the question also depends on if the positives of Angular and Meteor are things that you care about. Okay, so first component being Angular. And there's this Angular IO website, which is different than the old one. And I will also talk about the whole confusion or something that caused confusion when it comes to the version of Angular. The de facto standard now is to just call it Angular. And if you go to their website, I will try to. So this is their website. That's when you go there. They claim to be one framework, mobile and desktop. And the tutorial is like they also think about UX in a very smart way. You can do the quick start tutorial yourself if you want to get a head start on it. Maybe some of you already did that. And when it comes to features, I will let's just take a look at their website. So one is they're trying to get in the whole world of progressive web apps. I don't know how much you have dealt with this. And they also try to include native features, and this is where I will talk about this Ionic framework because it essentially is just built on top of Angular. And things that they are providing is actually a batteries included framework. So it's very opinionated, and they give you a lot of stuff. So in my own words, or from my perspective, when I talk to Meteor developers, they say, well, something that was great about Meteor in the past is that you just You get it, you use it, and you have all the things you need to get one app up and running. And nowadays, that seems to change a bit, but when it comes to Angular, it is a full framework, which is already something that is, for me, a crucial distinction between Angular and React, which these both tend to be weighed up against each other. And actually, I'm comparing something like apples to bananas. It's a different thing. All right, so much to that. Let's just continue. Let's see. Whoops, that's not where I want to go. Good. So some features I want to I just purposefully gave just a little snapshot just to the last one. I'm referring to I'm referring to this batteries included stuff here. So you have the whole thing. You have the router. You have HTTP calls to some backend. You have a form builder. You have security features, yada, yada, yada. But important for me to something that I want to point out is dependency injection, which I make extensive use of, and I really came to love the whole idea of dependency injection and how they're doing it specifically in Angular. Something else that I like is that the whole language that I'm using is TypeScript. So I have types, and I can enforce types, and my whole tooling, so my IDE, is taking that into consideration. And you will see that in a second, or in a couple seconds, minutes maybe, when we come to the demos. And something else is the reactive extensions, the RxJS, and the whole RxJS is built into the framework. So I am dealing with observables in this framework. When I want to take a look at the request.
But RxJS itself is an own framework.
Well, RxJS is an extension library to deal with observables. That's what it is. It's reactive extensions for JavaScript. And Angular makes use of RxJS. And it's not just like something optionally, but it's really in the core of Angular. Meaning that, for instance, when I try to get my query parameters or something like that, we had people on the camera don't know, but we had an issue that we talked about before, where do I get my data from and how does all of that come together? So what I can do is I can get an observable from my query parameters. And since we're talking about, or one thing that people build with this is single-page applications. So I might be on this one page, and my query parameters change, but I'm still on the same component, still on the same page, basically. And I can take that into consideration. So my component doesn't have to completely reload. I'm just still on the same thing, but my parameters changed, and so my observable fires, and I just can handle the new parameters. So this is something that it's not just the parameters, but like throughout the framework, they're using observables. And this is a very modern concept, the whole idea of using observables to have reactive programming. Okay, so about the version thing. Right now, we're in Angular version 4, and the whole framework is called just Angular. And the reason why it caused confusion was because there was a huge rewrite going on between Angular version 1 and Angular version 2. And it was like rewriting from scratch. And now I might get an idea that, well, if version 4 now, as a developer, if I had some Angular 1 code and I had to do rewrite my whole app or a lot of it to be able to upgrade to the next version, that's not true in the future, because they shifted now to semantic versioning, meaning that whenever there's a major change, they will up the major version. And it doesn't mean that they have rewritten the whole framework. It means just that something is not compatible with what they had before. And that can happen. And that's intended even. So you will see this number increasing in regular intervals. That's their tentative schedule. So every half year, it will up by 1. And they skipped 3 for a reason that I won't get into now. It's just to have consistency within the framework. So what is the basic building blocks or the things that I deal with when working with Angular? There's actually 7 things. One is the whole idea of having modules. And then when I'm designing or trying to build an app, I break the whole thing down into components. And this is the second building block. And when it comes to what will I show in these components, so these components themselves, they have templates. And that's this guy here. Something else that Angular does is combining the values that I query from backend or something like that, and the template. So how do these two guys communicate with each other? And that's where data binding comes into play. Then structural directives is something that for me belongs to, in some way belongs to the templates. It turned out that building components is not the best strategy for any use case, especially when it comes to just like real display concerns where I want to, like, let's say I have thinking about like a card and I want to put information inside the card. I might do something like build a card component. It sounds smart. Okay, I want to have cards. I might want to reuse these cards, so I'll build a card component. But then things get tricky because I want to have very different stuff inside the card. So will it have a one card component with one input parameter, which is content, and then it gets complicated to have to really follow down the rabbit trail to find out what this card is actually doing, because I might want to have very different cards in my system. And the idea is actually to not use components, but instead use directives. And then I can just use this directive and have all my custom stuff inside this card definition. So it's all in one glance. So I can have this special plant component inside this directive, so wrapped inside the directive. That's where I think directives are very useful. Then the next thing, and this is where dependency injection hooks in, are services. Services are actually just logic blocks of code that I can take as they are and inject into any of my components. And when it comes to the dependency injection system, I have a choice of having either one global singleton, so let's say a user or auth service. I just have my auth service and I have it once, and any component that talks to the service, it's just instantiated once and it will get the same user. However, that's not the only option. I can also instantiate versions of the services down the component tree. So for instance, a pagination service, because I don't want a global singleton, but for every list component, I want its own instance of this pagination service, which also, so that I can have 2 lists on the same page, and if I click the next button, they can keep state independently. Talking about state management, this is something where there's different patterns out there, and an alternative to this local state management, or in this case, service-based state management, is the whole Redux pattern. And there's also an implementation that I use to get the same pattern. And I have played around with both, and I see pros and cons, like this idea of, for me personally, maybe you have some other solutions, but when it comes to this pagination, where I want to have different state depending on different instances of components, depending on what the user sees, is something that, for me, it's really hard to map it into one global store. So the idea of this Redux store, where I have one store and then IDs for the different paginators, and then trying to retrieve them from the store by their pagination instance ID or something like that, it's not very intuitive. And using services as a store is more intuitive. For me, it's more intuitive when it comes to these challenges. Okay, so services and the dependency injection. That's how they play together. So I have my component. The component uses these injected services, And the metadata of the component makes it aware of its resources, like what template does it use. And in the templates, I can use directives and pipes, which pipes just being mutations of the data being displayed. Okay, so next up, Ionic. Ionic themselves say the top open source framework for building amazing mobile apps. And it says mobile apps, but they have turned their focus to actually be mobile, desktop, web, so cross devices. And I will show you a demo of how that looks like in practice. And so you can think of it as a framework on top of Angular to provide features for dealing with making them mobile and having a consistent look across devices. Good. So much to Ionic. That was quick. And the next one will be even quicker because this is a Meteor meetup, and you guys, some of you know plenty about Meteor, so I will completely skip it. And let's move on. So we have ended up at our first big milestone, namely having all the dependencies, having talked about all the dependencies. So the next thing is putting these two together. And if and when I put them together, then I have, like, these are the things that I want to point out. One is that from the world of reactive programming and Angular supporting the idea of having things as observables, that's like the one side that I associate with Angular right now. And then I have the publication and some subscription side of things. That's one particular thing that when dealing with with Meteor and obtaining data. So actually, the feature that I'm talking about is Minimongo, having it in the client, having the same so the same method calls in the available on the client and on the server side, and declaring what data is visible for the user, and then being able to query that on both sides. So what this package does, essentially, or one thing that I identified for, is it's the glue. It's gluing Angular as a front end and Meteor as a back end together, and gives me collection observables. So the regular, if you have been using Meteor, so you're used to storing your stuff in collections, and in this case, I get one observable per collection, and I can do stuff with it. I can query it with all the API that with the same API, so the API that you already know. All right, so how does all of this look like? And I have a couple of, like 3 demos, so I want to skip to this one.
Four screens or 10 screens? Or
It's just desktops, not screens, and it's 6. Okay, so Callum, do you know the shortcut for making the whole thing presentable?
View in the view menu, and then enter presentation at the bottom, start from the bottom.
Yep. Thank you. Okay, but now I don't see the, there we go. Okay. So this is one app that I built, and I want to show it to you for demo purposes now. That's the rough outline of it. So I don't know particularly what your background is, so I will just try to talk about some essentials here. Basically, since the talk is about Angular and Meteor, one thing is to mention when it comes to this, to using this, I don't know how to call it. Is it a library? I'll just say library for now. One way of using this library, and that's the one that's, that you will find instructed on their tutorials, is I have one directory for where all of my Meteor stuff lives. I don't know if you can see it up there. This is the API directory here. And I have this source folder where my Angular stuff lives. So this is essentially very separated. Why would I do that? The reason being that I have one code base and I can deploy my Android app, my iOS app, my web application, and my server from this code base. So that's the idea. And what are the benefits apart from like having them in one code base when it comes to, well, theoretically, I could just have this Meteor server completely on its own and then have the Angular stuff completely separated as well. But then I wouldn't have access in my client to all of the methods that the server uses, and essentially then being capable of faking, like locally doing changes optimistically, which is what Minimogo does, and then getting the true source from the true answer from the backend and updating. That's how it does it. How the library does it is actually building a bundle for the client out of the server, and then including that bundle in the client. Okay, so let's take a look. On my server, I have some collections. For instance, here, this outcomes collection and Mongo observable collection outcomes. So this is what I do, and this is what I get out of this here, the Meteor RxJS. And once I have set up my collection, I have some publications that I do, where, for instance, here I can, like this is classical Meteor stuff. It's not something specific to Angular Meteor, where I can define what stuff, in this case, what outcomes the user will see, and what children's, what like sub collections are associated with it. And okay, so that's so much for the API and from the Meteor side of things. And then when it comes to Angular, sorry, was there a question?
No, I was just wondering the line 41, like everything TypeScript, yeah.
Okay, let's go back in the publications file.
Yeah, it's the TypeScript. Line
Yes.
41,
this is TypeScript. So in this case, that's also one particularity which you might, if you're like not used to using TypeScript or Angular for that matter. Since I am using Angular on the client side, it makes sense for me to have it consistent throughout my code base. And so I can also use TypeScript in the server. And what that gives me is if I have something like outcome here, I can jump to its interface. And if I do things, I get all the auto-completion, and it will tell me some errors in like while writing the code, and I don't have to wait for runtime to discover some errors. And this is really handy. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, great. Okay, so then next up on the front-end side of things. So what do I now do with these things? And this particular demo or example here is built with Ionic. And that's why instead of having the name components, there's also one directory called pages, which are nothing else but components. But the difference is that these components are have special meaning, namely they map one-to-one to application views. And I will show you how that looks like exactly. Here, let's say, okay, so I have manager, and then there's this outcomes component, and inside of that, let's take a look. I have this in the init function, I have this Meteor observable, and I subscribe to my outcomes collection. And in this case, I say, okay, this find outcomes, this scope, and this find outcomes. If I take a closer look at this, I will see the outcomes.find method, and this is essentially the API that you're used to when dealing with Meteor collections.
What is the zone?
Oh, Um, I think it's out of the scope of this talk, but in previous versions, what I did is I could zone this, so to say, zone the result of it. And what it does is it helps to make my component aware of when to update the view depending on the data source that changed, so that I get live updates whenever something changes from here.
So it's specific
to Angular. It's the detection strategy. And I don't, this is an older version. I don't use this anymore. But yeah, that's how that came into existence. So you can, this is taking a look at the observable interface. That's something that I have available here. And I didn't fully, to be honest, I didn't fully go into the details of it. I just took a look at the sample code and found out that it didn't work without it, so I just added it. That's how it came into existence. All right, so, and once I have these objects available here, so this is essentially using Meteor as a backend. All the rest is just Ionic code, or yeah, so Angular code, more specifically Ionic code. If you're not used to Angular, and just in this case, so this is how a component looks like in Angular. You have a class, and this is the metadata I was talking about, and the metadata tells it how I can reference it. So if in any template I were to write, if I were to write something like this, then I would get, this component rendered in here, or so instead of this. So what else? Then another information I provide here is the template URL. I could essentially also write the whole template inline in here by using this template syntax and then writing some HTML. But since I want to be consistent, and it does maybe make sense for some very small components, and if you're into building micro components, then it might be good to just have one file and the whole thing is the component itself. I personally prefer to have them looking like this, where I have actually 3 files per component. The TS TypeScript file where my logic is, then the HTML file with the template, and the third one that I can optionally use, I could just delete it here, but it is local styles. So I can have styles that are only and really only bound to this component, and they don't affect the rest of my application, which is something, I think this is something really great. If I want to have something affect more, I'll just go up the component tree and have it define it globally or in some other scope. Okay, and in practice, this looks like, let me see where I am. It looks like this. So this is the outcomes page that I referenced, and yeah, let me get back to it. And right here, what I see is the data that is rendered from Meteor in this Ionic component. And just to show how these belong together, I'll just also take a look at the template. And if I can find my way back to it, that is. Sorry, I'm not used to this presenting mode. So outcomes. Okay, so this is this outcomes list component. And inside this outcomes component, I have outcome items. And I bind them to this, I pass the outcomes, the objects that I get from Meteor, to this outcome item component. And if I take a look at the outcome item component, I just jump to it now, then it itself has a template. And in here, so this is the whole component, jumping down the component tree. This is what I get, and this is what I see here. And when I take a look at the data that I'm referring to, like outcome.start, outcome.deadline, and all these things here, this is actually the things that you see displayed here. So test2d is, for instance, the, where is it? status, and somewhere over here, I think I have the outcome.name. And to again show how the whole thing is now connected to Meteor, I have this Mongo booster, which is basically just an inspector for my Meteor collection, and it shows me my local data that Meteor has access to right now, the stuff that is stored on the server side of things, so to speak. And this is exactly the same data that I have displayed here. So for instance, this demo is here. So if I put this on the right side, and I change this from going into the database right now, demo, Meteor, and if I press enter now, bam, instant update. The whole thing is live data. So I don't have any page refreshes and anything like that, as you're used to as Meteor developers. So this is real-time data. So what's nice about this, to wrap up? First of all, I have the Meteor mini Mongo caching and syncing with the server stuff. I have all of the methods isomorphic in the client and in the server, and it can do the updates optimistically. And I own my data, so if I compare it to other solutions out there when it comes to real-time data, some of the other ones I don't have access to, like all the list of users, specifically talking about Firebase, which there are some benefits and there are some downsides to both sides. And this is just if you want to combine the features of Meteor and the features of Angular, then this is the package that you can choose. And there's different ways of using it as well. OK, so another demo that I have, the second one now, is just to give an idea of, wait, that's not the one. I'm getting confused here. Yeah. When I talked about state management, I want to do one more checkup. Speed up, slow down. OK, then I'll continue. So this is basically a different version of the same app. And I'll just stop the other one for now. Yeah, where is it? That's weird. I'm actually looking for one that I can find. Well, actually, I only need the code to show. So in here, is it still the same one? I think it's not. Yeah, it's not. So when it comes to state management, one thing that I also came to like, as I mentioned before, is the Redux pattern. And one implementation of it is right here. It's built on the, so it's called ngrx/store and also ngrx/effects. This ngrx/store is for having like, it's just one implementation of the Redux pattern, and effects is an implementation of side effects for this pattern. And how it looks like is that you have this one store with all your actions and effects and reduces, and actions looking like, for instance, like going to the manager. So I have the definition of my action types, and then actions have two things. So they have a name and a payload. And if you're familiar with Redux, so if not, then just you can ignore this part.
What is this type actually returning, this type function that you call in this?
Pardon?
Just curious, what is this type returning?
Which type, which line are you talking about?
Yeah, you somehow call a function called type.
What are you talking?
Lines. What is it returning?
Which line?
Which line?
Line 13, line 9, 10, 11, 12, 13. There is type you call. What is type returning?
Oh, I'm defining my own type here.
Yeah, what is the type? Custom type.
Yeah, a custom type, basically.
This is
From TypeScript, yes.
From TypeScript. Ah, okay. You reference a TypeScript type by the string integer load success, and then
Well, I haven't looked into the specifics of how this works behind the scenes, but what I'm actually like really doing here is I'm trying to make sure that this is unique. So every action is unique and uniquely identifiable in the system. And so the idea is that I can later check, hey, is this of type load success? And if so, please do this.
Okay.
So in this file, I have all my actions for the manager defined in here. And then I can create constructors for these. So for instance, the update outcome has its own payload structure. And what I do here, I define that it needs to have an ID and it needs to have a changes which is of type object. So my TypeScript will reject any action that I try to create somewhere. So in my interface, if I want to have this update outcome action, and I say new update outcome action, and I give it a payload that is different than this one, it will tell me. Meaning that also for development, for maintenance, if I want to change the payload structure, it will show me all the files that I need to change in order to be consistent. Refactorings are way easier that way. Does that answer your question?
A little bit, yeah.
With the type?
Yeah, I just wonder. I was just curious. I mean, what is it returning this type? But I mean, if it's a TypeScript thing, then I will just figure it out.
Maybe you can make sense out of this.
So it's returning from type cache a string.
Yeah, so it just creates a cached custom type. Okay, so I have all my actions defined in here, and then something else that I do once I have my actions, I write reducers for my actions. And in this specific implementation of this Redux pattern, it might look like this. So I have my interface for the state, so what I want to store here. So in this case, it's outcomes and the selected outcome. I give it an initial state to start with, and then I have my reducer, which actually just takes one state, takes the action, and returns a new state. And that's what I do here. So I differentiate depending on the action type, and which is like TypeScript is doing some serious magic right here when it comes to dealing with these things, because
normally Redux is just using types as strings, if this type is called string blah blah blah.
You can also do that here. You can also use strings.
Oh, yeah.
But in this case, I get some magic by not using strings, because if I use strings, then my IDE has no clue what it is. If I use types, and I have this, like, if I say action type is load success, and that's a type, then if I say action.payload, it knows what the payload is, and I can get auto completion depending on the payload. So what do I have available inside my payload? And I wouldn't get that if it's just a string. And it's even smarter than that. So the case, here this case switch, it knows what the case switch is, not just by this type, but also it goes back to the definition of where this type and how it's associated with, like in my action definition, there's actually many different types, and depending on the type, it can select it's called a discriminator, so it discriminates which payload I'm using, because payload is a method that's like all of them have this payload, but it figures out which payload I'm talking about depending on the switch case, and then gives me auto-completion, and shows me errors, which is really freaky. Yeah, and in practice, that's really what it does. So if I have, where can I show, like action.payload? I can't think of an intuitive example right now, but like here. So I say payload dot, and I get auto-completion of the possible things that I have at hand in this case. So even as a developer, if I don't have no clue what I defined before, it tells me what I have, and if what I want to have is not in here, I can jump back and see why that is not the case. So in this case, I can jump back here and say, okay, yeah, that's exactly what I have. It's outcome ID and the step name, and I can update it here. And if I update it here and some other place, it breaks my consistency. It will say, one moment, Geraldo, please change it here. That's exactly what it does down here, by the way. It says, and it doesn't just tell me errors, but also things that I'm not, like unused stuff. So it helps me clean up my, my code. And the third thing, yeah, this is just, I don't want to like go into depth here. But yeah, okay, so to close that up, to close this demo up, the whole idea here is that all my components know of, any of my front-end components, is the store, nothing else. So if I go back to pages and outcomes, and oops, that's steps, but let's keep here. So the thing that all that this component is aware of is the store. And I can either get stuff from the store, and I get only observables. So anything that I get is an observable. So whenever it changes in the store, I will instantly see the new version of it in my front end. And if I can purposefully choose if I just want to take just take one snapshot of it and ignore all the updates. But I can use the stream instead. So getting back to this here, I can select stuff from the store to get these observables, and I can dispatch actions. Like in here, as soon as I open this outcomes list, it fires this load action, and what else? Where else do we do something? Yeah, not really doing much here. Yeah, but the point is it doesn't have state. All my components are stateless, all of them. And all they do is get observables from the store and dispatch actions to the store. So that's the idea behind this pattern. And I can also demo this if you want to. Yes, no, yes, no, yes, 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 okay. So then I'll just, let me check. How do I get back out? Let's just take this one. So transpiling all the stuff. I have multiple instances of these things open I prepared a few things. I didn't close them, so it's really slow now. Damn. And so this would be the desktop-ish version of it, and this would be the mobile version. And also, like from the front-end side of things, Ionic gives me out of the box the whole experience. I don't have to like really wrap my brain around how this menu is rendered out. It just does it. It's very convenient.
But when you want to change it, do you have to wrap your head around it? But if you want to change it and customize it?
Like what? Can you give me an example? I can do some live coding. This is a cloned branch.
I don't know. I mean, you want to now customize Ionic, and I don't know.
What specifically do I want to customize here?
I don't know.
You can think about something. In the meantime, I'll just show what I talked about here.
Okay.
So here in outcomes, I have 2 outcomes, and if I switch, the whole thing doesn't know anything about state. So what it does, I have my outcomes collection, and if I switch here, it's actually not displaying different data. It's still displaying the same observable. The difference is that when clicking on week, I'm setting the filter, and the filter is also in the store. And the observable is just a mixture of two observables, namely the filter observable and the outcomes observable, and it's called, I remember it, reselect or something like that is the library, and I can just, the idea is that I do very simple definitions of things that I want to observe, and then I can like play Lego and build complex structures out of it. Yeah. So also when I now, wait, is this which version of the app am I running here? 3. Okay, so I know which what stuff I can demo and what I can't. Yeah, so what I can do here is I can add steps. So, and as you see, also things like 0 of 2, it updates, it's all streamed data. And if I were to open like a second tab and create a new step, then the one from 2 will just skip, like if I create a new one, then it's 1 out of 3. So it's all, everything that you see is live data. In this particular demo, the user, when I log out, all of these things are live, and I tell my components how to react to different states. That's all I do. And it's a very different model than the classical one of seeing each view differently, because I'm not having concrete values anywhere. It's all streams of data. Okay, so I'll close that part. And then here, just to show one of the alternatives I don't want to show, I'll just talk about it. This is another implementation of the same thing, in this case using Firebase as a backend, and I played around with it as well. And the reason why I show, oh, it's really getting slow now. The reason why I'm like also have this prepared is in case we want to compare some alternatives. So, and this is where I want to get back to the slides, because I want to talk about my experience, like what were the good things, what were the bad things, and what are the alternatives. So what I really like, okay, let's go to the next slide. The alternatives. So when it comes to the front end, I can use Blaze, which we already heard. The opinions are varied. Some people say it will die. Some people say no, it won't. But that's an alternative. So you can also use any of the other front end frameworks. And on the back end side of things, there's apart from the classical building a separate REST API, I can have a GraphQL, which is like a future-oriented solution that I really like, and I'm looking into it. And when it comes to something that sounds like that claims to be like very easy because I don't have to maintain that much, which is a backend as a service, and there's different versions, and one that I played along with recently is Firebase, and all of these have pros and cons. And I think they are relevant when I talk about the combination of Angular and Meteor, because the things that I like about this Angular Meteor combination, in contrast to some other things, when I specifically want real-time data, and some, like comparing it to now Firebase. In Firebase, currently, I cannot do, or I don't have access to all, I can't control everything that's going on behind the scenes. So again, just as we heard before, I'm giving up control to get speed, or in this case, ease of maintainability. But when I want to do some more complex stuff, then I came to the point where I hit my limits with Firebase very early on. And yeah, maybe we will open that up for discussion for later, but for now, I also want to know what you guys think and want to know. So any questions, feedback, or perspectives?
Yeah, about the like the layout, what he was saying, like how easy is it to like actually have a different layout towards like the apps you showed right now like look really Ionic-ish, like you have like the header and the footer, and it looks really. Can you like go away from that theme and like just like do whatever you want to, and then just like don't know,
Mm-hmm.
still like have the native support, like native app support?
So the question is, if I use this kind of stack, will I be able to change the look of it, the feel of it, and like how would that look like? And the answer is yes, completely. You have access to all the like these to the native API, which below the scenes uses also Cordova and stuff. It's just abstracted away, and I can have an easy interface. And the look of it, I can completely customize it because it's just Angular components. That means that I can change any of it. I can change any style. I can change the logic, the display logic of it. I can I can not use this menu altogether and write my own menu and just put it there instead. That's all completely possible. And if you have a real use case that you want to see, like how wide is the menu bar? When does it show? Should it show at all? Is it on the left or on the right side? I could demo this right now. It's really trivial to change things.
Yeah, if you like, so you can like basically take every website basically, like if you program it with Angular 2 or like better or more like
Just say Angular. The current state is version 4, but it's Angular.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
You program stuff with Angular any way you like it, and then you can add like stuff like camera support or file explorer
Yeah.
or something like that. And then it automatically, like if you load the page up in the browser, it will like if you load it up in Firefox, it will ask you can I use the camera. If I load it up in iOS, it just takes the camera. It just knows like where it is, and it
Mm-hmm.
just does it. Or
So a great question. And so first of all, there's default styles. And what they do is they mimic the default of the device that you're targeting. So for instance, let's take the example of a card. And, or I think buttons might be even more interesting because they have very particular styles for the different platforms. Where's buttons? Well, let me go here. So here, I have some buttons, and this is how it would look like per default on the iOS, and this is how it looked like on an Android device, and this is how it looked like on a Windows phone. So they have different styles depending on the platform that I'm on. And you can either go with these defaults, or you can customize them, or you can also say that like no matter the device, I always want this. I always want material design. You can just customize them, and you can really go into depth. You have these SAS variables that you can configure. I think it's somewhere in the intro.
Stuff is a little bit material design.
Pardon?
The Android stuff is material
Yeah,
design,
so
actually.
and also like the action buttons or things like that, or like in my case you saw this tabs down there, and in iOS they would, or I think in Windows they would be on the top and not on the bottom. So they try to stick to the UX experience that users from these devices are used to. So when I have a semantic language, I can say this button should be at the start, and the device can decide where the start is, unless you override the defaults. You can say, for me, I always want them on the top left. That's where I want them. So you are able to override them, but it's for me, I really don't want to override most of the stuff because I like to not care about the particularities. Does that answer the question?
kind of, because like what about the native support? Like how do you like give an Angular component the possibility to use the camera or like read a file from a file system?
So
Use Cordova plugins.
yeah, this is what you do. You add a Cordova plugin, and then in the components you can, like here, you do something like this, like camera get picture, and then you can handle the returning result. So you have an API talking to the local device.
Okay.
Other questions? But this is really this is particularly Ionic and not Angular Meteor. So I also want to know if there's some questions regarding the combination. And if not, then I want to share something. Like, I really liked the idea. I really liked the idea when I came across the project. I was like, wow, this sounds very interesting because I liked some of the features. Now that I have a feeling that some of these features, when it comes to Meteor, will go away, I'm not so sure anymore. And also, I'm not using Angular Meteor anywhere in production because the community is not very big. Like, if you go to Angular Meteor and then start with our tutorials, and what you get is the state that it doesn't change. It didn't change lately, so last update. Yeah, so February 2017, which doesn't sound too bad, but I know, like, if I click play here, then you hear me talking. So I provided these things. I tried to spark somehow to get the community to.
These tutorials are from you.
Yes. So I tried.
Awesome.
I added this video tutorials to make it easier for people to grasp what this is actually, but then it didn't get so much traction. And I think the reason is there were many people who asked, also in the Gritter channel, people came and asked some questions, but then the initiator of this project is really traveling around and very busy, and I had a hard time also like having a close contact going on. And so I myself decided that this is really promising, the idea, but on the other hand, I want something that's either more mature or where I can, like, where I have where I'm more in contact with a bigger community. And that's why I'm not using it. So community for me personally is one decision as a developer of what stack I choose. That's why I'm not choosing this one. Yes?
So what stack can you use to actually achieve exactly the same thing? Like,
What alternatives?
yeah.
For instance, when it comes to the front-end layer, you could use React and the Redux pattern for state, and on the back end, you can use one of these, like, backend as a service GraphQL libraries, or you can go very classical and have a REST API server, like, I don't know, Django, Rails, anything like that, and then use something like React Native and build your app with that. So that's yeah. I personally am playing around with Ionic and Firebase right now. That's where I'm exploring to see like also the limits, and I'm trying to tap into not just the specific stack, but more also what concepts are there, and I want to. Yeah, I'm really curious when it comes to technology. I'm a geek. I love technology, and I want to know what direction the whole thing is heading. And so one trend that is definitely there is reactive programming, dealing with streams instead of concrete values. And yeah, so the real answer is it depends on your specific use case. I guess that's the not very helpful, but very true answer. Other questions? Okay, so no more questions. We can continue the discussion on a like eye level. I think I prefer that. So that was my take on how I combined Angular Meteor, played around with it, and decided I want more community.